was 12 years old when Abdu'l-Baha was here. My parents will take one of us at a time down to a LaSalle hotel to see Abdu'l-Baha, to meet Abdu'l-Baha. When it was my turn, there was a group there, and he motioned me forward, put his arm around me, kissed me on the forehead. My parents had become Baha'is in 1898. And in our home, from then on, they started to hold fireside classes and meetings, which we attended. And of course, I would usually sit on the floor, lie on the floor, and fall asleep before the meeting was over. To me, besides, most of us attended all of his public meetings, and I was so greatly impressed every time I would see him. He'd pace back and forth on the stage, and he's just, you see such power latent within that person. There was a famous American artist who became Baha'i, Mrs. Julia Thompson. She said just to look into those eyes was enough for her. And as he stood back and forth on the stage, you can just see and realize the strength and power that is within that body.
The younger children or smaller children were placed in a circle on the floor, the older children in chairs around the younger children, and then the adults lined themselves around the wall. We all waited, of course, for him to enter the room with his interpreters. When he entered, it was a very impressive sight. As small as I was, I could see the radiance or the dignity of this man who was to make such an impression on all our lives. As he sat down, of course, I was impressed too by the fact that he was using a chair that was very similar to the chairs that kings are coronated in. And so the whole picture of Abdul-Baha sitting there in all his splendor was imprinted on my mind. He called each of the younger children up first and placed them on his lap. He kissed some of them on the forehead. He patted some on the head. I was patted, if I remember, as he put his arms around me. And I had a feeling that I would prefer to be on the floor, that I wanted to get off his knee. Now, what caused it, I couldn't tell you. Of course, being 3, it probably was the fact that I just, you know how 3-year-olds are. Not interested in sitting too long. But everybody asks, what did he say to you? Well, he did talk to each one of the children. He asked their names and whispered something to them. Of course, if you see any of the pictures of me, I looked like I was very unhappy. So I kind of think that he said, please be happy.
It was in the home of very prominent early Baha'is, Mrs. Goodall and Ella Cooper, and actually the home was in Oakland. But they lived in San Francisco, and my father had the privilege of serving the household. And when Abdul-Baha came and stayed in this home in Oakland, he had the supreme bounty of serving Abdul-Baha. The three of us, my older brother, myself, and my younger brother, received names from Abdul-Baha. My older brother was named Hassan, mine was Hussein, and my younger brother, who was still not born, he was born after Abdul-Baha had left California. He chose the name of Farouk, which means blessed, and I think he would serve both gender, which was smart of him. I needn't to tell you that, but he thinks of everything. I think I had the pleasure of sitting on his lap, as they tell me, because I was only just over a year old. So the recollection of his face and feature is not too good. But I think that I had received some of the spirit that he always gave forth. And for that, I feel very gracious, and I don't think that is something that I would treasure forever. Thank you.
I was quite young when Abdu'l-Baha came to Kenosha. That's where I was born and raised. And it's dear to me because I had my early childhood spent there. However, I remember when Abdu'l-Baha walked into the hall in which he was to speak. It seemed like so many of the friends were standing at the entrance of the hall to shake hands with him. And I was impressed. And many of the ladies sat on chairs on the opposite wall with their children, and I was one of them. And then Abdu'l-Baha was guided to a table where he was the head of the table because it was a Baha'i feast, I think. My parents told me that. I didn't know the difference at the time. However, Abdu'l-Baha sat down, and the rest of us were in the room, of course, but we didn't sit at the table at that time. However, he seemed to devote much of his attention after he had shaken hands with the friends to the children. And children are impressed if adults give them the love, and Abdu'l-Baha sure could do it. And I just stood there and gazed at him. I don't remember too much about it, but Mother always tells me. She said that he asked me what I would like, because it was a big dish or a bowl of fruit. And I always liked bananas, so he gave me one, and I treasured that very much. That's a blessing that I hope I will be worthy of as time goes on.
I was fortunate enough to have my picture taken with Abdul-Baha and Rahui Macomb. And, I've always, people ask me what effect it had on me, so on and so forth. My life, I couldn't answer that. But I've always felt that I knew him personally. And of course I didn't. But from that, I always felt I knew him personally. I wanted to tell you kind of a funny episode. My mother wrote to Abdul-Baha asking him if he'd please name me. And my mother belonged to the women's club in the town we lived in. And she got no answer from Abdul-Baha. And these women got up in arms saying, "When you going to name that baby?" And my mother said, "When the name comes from Haifa, I'll name him." So they said, "No, we'll name him." This happened to be the town of Clyde. "We'll name him Clyde." So I had the name of Clyde for quite some time until the letter came from Abdu'l-Baha, the tablet, I should say, and he said, "Name thy baby Joseph." This is kind of silly to bring up at this meeting, but I think there's some merit to it. As I said, I was 5 years old. The people ask me, "Do you remember?" And my answer's always been, "I think I do." And because I'm not sure. I don't know enough about psychology to know what age you can remember things. But I do remember this, that we lived kitty corner from the fire station. And I can remember when they were drawn by horses. And 1912 was a year that the fire department started mechanizing the fire department. I can remember the name of the two horses, Bob and George. So I think if I could remember that, possibly I remembered something about Abdul-Baha.
All during the evening, I wanted to share with the group the fact of my mother's healing. For over a year, she had a tumor of the breast, and they didn't know in those days whether it was cancerous or not, or anything much about it. But it was a serious condition. And when Abdul-Baha came to this country, word came to us very suddenly that he was coming. And my mother had an appointment to go to the hospital for an operation on this breast. And she said that she kept hearing, "Arise and go to the divine physician." And this kept ringing through her mind, and she insisted with my father, who was a physician, that she go. There wasn't really a great amount of financial substance in the family, because my father had just finished medical school, and you know in those days they didn't walk into a practice that was affluent at once by any manner of means. So mother went alone. And mother was a very impulsive, a difficult person for many people to understand, because she would have a surge of spirit and she'd decide to do something no matter what the end result was, and she didn't think about the end results either. But she got to Chicago, excuse me, and she expected to stay there a day, hear Abdul-Baha, see Abdul-Baha, and be healed and go home. It didn't work just that way. And someone saw her in the hotel looking quite distressed. It was Mrs. Greenleaf, and she asked what the trouble was. And mother told her, she knew Mrs. Greenleaf somewhat, knew her son better because he had come to Cleveland and talked with the Cleveland people. And she said, "Why, you mustn't be distressed about money. I'm taking you home with me, and we will have our appointment, our interview, our audience with Abdul-Baha together." And usually they were received 3 or 4 at a time with him, and there would be an interpreter and some of his entourage that traveled with him present. And so they did this, and they said, "Well, we will get a big notebook and we'll put all our questions. We have so many questions, and we'll be able to get the answers. This will be a marvelous opportunity." And they were busy writing in there. It was a kind of campus tablet. I don't know whether they use that term or not, but a little tablet.
And when she was in Abdu'l-Baha, when she walked into the room, the light was so bright that she was practically dazed. She couldn't, she described it, she had an otherworld feeling. She didn't feel that she was even there. The brightness bothered her dreadfully. And she tried to listen to Dr. Zia Baghdadi interpreting what Abdul-Baha had said. She didn't understand anything. The tablet had dropped to the floor, and she never thought of the tablet. Then, when she got up, she passed near Abdul-Baha, and he ran his hand down her side, not touching it, but made this motion. And Mother was seized with a very great pain, and she prayed that that pain be removed. I've always thought that spiritual healing was easy, just over like that. It was done, it was completed, without perhaps any suffering. But Mother said the pain in her was excruciating. But as she passed on out of that room, she never saw that tumor again. This we have not told often, because early in the history, we were not attracting people to Abdul-Baha or to the Baha'i faith for healing their bodies, but for healing their souls. Out in the hallway, Dr. Baghdadi, who was the interpreter, came over to Mother and told her, he said, "I'd better talk with you. I saw that you didn't hear too much." She said, "I didn't hear a thing." And he didn't seem too surprised, but he explained a number of things, and he was answering the questions in that tablet that was lying on the floor, and that Mother had completely forgotten. Then he said, "I want to tell you something that he told you that you must not forget. This is very important." He said, Abdul-Baha said, "You will become a star scintillating down through the ages." And Mother often said to people who became, Mother knew, and she often said that people who were dedicated to the faith had this promise, these great promises, and her life was full of great difficulty. And she always leaned upon that particular sentence. One thing we haven't mentioned tonight, and I was so happy when I heard all of you laughing. Abdul-Baha said constantly, "You must be happy. Be happy. Please be happy." And it was to my mother that he used this word, "Please be happy." And she felt almost as if it were a sin if she were not happy after that. And she was quite good at keeping a happy attitude in life during many, many problems. Abdul-Baha just didn't touch our lives. He changed them completely.
It was rather ironic. I had nothing to do with seeing Abdu'l-Baha, really. It was just an accident of my birth, I think. I don't think there was anything about me that deserved it in the least. And it was rather strange that when he came to this country in 1912, my mother was not a Baha'i. She was investigating the faith, and she thought, well, you know, she lived 150 miles south of here. but she thought, well, I don't know if I want to spend the money and go up to Chicago. I just don't know about this. I don't know if it's the truth or not, so I won't go. And then by a few years later, when she was an ardent and devoted Baha'i, I heard her say that if she had to go to the poor farm when she was an old lady, she still wanted to go to Haifa to see the master. And it was arranged. And I went because I was her daughter. It was a great privilege, and I do think that I had the privilege of seeing him in a little different environment from what you do when he was here in the United States. I saw how he lived there in the Holy Land. I saw a few of the problems that surrounded him, and how he gave his whole life to serving everybody around there. He was known by everyone in Haifa, as you probably realize. People would even come to him if they were ill and they thought they didn't want to go to the hospital without seeing him first. I remember one day standing there, and he came out from his busy work and greeted this gentleman who was ill and told him if he would go to the hospital, it would be all right. And then the gentleman went to the hospital. And I remember that we thought that was a rather selfish thing on the part of the gentleman. But it shows us that the master, as they always called him, I never heard him called Abdu'l-Baha there. He was called the master. But it shows how he truly loved and truly helped bring out in each person their very best and help them to lead a better life, and how he was always ready to serve them. He was up late at night with letters. He was busy all day long seeing people. His table at which we ate in the evenings in Haifa was filled with guests, not necessarily Baha'is, who came and wanted to be with him or get his advice or what have you. And so his whole life there was given to the service, and people came to him, as I understand, with small details that it would seem could be settled in the kitchen or by somebody else, but they always would turn to him for guidance and for assurance that what they were doing was right. And he was very solicitous of us. He had us go, of course, we went to Akka in a different way from what people go now. It was with horses and carriage along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, with the horses' feet and the wheels in the water of the Mediterranean Sea, which I thought was great fun. And we saw camels being unloaded or fixed up, whatever they do with camels when they have sore feet, as they went into the door of the gate of Akka, the same gate that Bahaullah went through when he was sent there many years earlier. And we had a busy and a very happy and rewarding day there in Akka. And when we came back at the master's table at dinner, he was very solicitous and asked if we were tired. And he said we must go and rest, but we must never forget that day. He was telling us that the important part of the pilgrimage was praying at the shrine of Bahaullah. He was telling us that in that way. He did give me a name. We saw him privately for a little while. My mother was disturbed because she felt that she had perhaps asked too much of her husband, who was not a Baha'i, to get the money so that we could take this long trip around. It was a difficult trip. It took 2 months to get there. A great many difficulties because the World War I was just over. England had just taken over the Holy Land, and things were not in a settled condition at all. It took visas to get into Palestine, as it was then called, and that took time and negotiating, and there were strikes on the boat as we went. They didn't want to load the coal on the boat, and we'd wait a few days in Italy for that to be settled, and so on. It was a rather difficult, lengthy trip, but it was worth it. And the master assured my mother that all would be well, that we would be all right, that our trip back would be safe, that we would be protected. And he gave me a name, Baha'i, which I have never been able to use, partly because I was already Sylvia when I was 11 years old and people didn't want to change, partly because my family mostly were not at all interested in the faith or even sympathetic. And so I was Sylvia. But I think that perhaps, pardon me, the important thing is that, you know, the generations go on after us. And I have a number of grandchildren, some of whom are devoted and active Baha'is. The name has gone on to my granddaughter in South America, and she is proving to be a very steadfast and a very firm Baha'i at the age of 13. And I think that perhaps I can serve the faith mostly by helping and passing on to the next generation some of the inspiration and the love which the Master showered upon me, which I really didn't deserve at all. It was just a pure accident that I happened to go. And I want to say one other thing, that I think what impressed me the most about being with him was the sound of his voice. I never in all my life heard a voice like that. It was ringing, it was strong. Now he at this time was an elderly man. He was not wholly well, perhaps, I don't know, but his voice was powerful. It had a beautiful, beautiful overtones. It was vibrant and ringing, and he laughed a great deal, especially with me because I was a child. And I thought, as I saw him for the last time, when he bade us goodbye in the evening before we were to leave, if I could only carry in my mind the mental of the sound of that wonderful, wonderful voice, which really brought joy and power and inspiration to those who heard it. He always wanted to make us happy and to feel that we were blessed, but that beautiful voice, I hope I can never forget how wonderful it was and what an impression it made on me.